All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome to day two. My name is Declan Harvey, if you weren't here yesterday, and I'll be trying my best to step us through what is, as Joe indicated, an awful lot to get through in the next few hours. One thing that struck me yesterday was a comment by one of the participants. He said that during the COVID era, we've all become quite accustomed to the term bubbles and creating bubbles and living in bubbles, but actually we're at the point of this process after 3 years of the dialogues about race and ethnicity that we have to start getting out of the bubbles. Today we very much pivot towards practical, tangible steps that we can take wherever we live and work in order to make change. I'm on buzzword watch today. I think if we start hearing stuff like compassion and care and peace building and all that, my job today will try and be to delve a bit deeper. What exactly do we mean by that? It's very easy to use these words, but I think we should be much more specific than that. What are we talking about when we are using these phrases? You can comment. It was so useful yesterday getting your input, not just questions, but your reflections. Some of the questions we could answer, some of them were more rhetorical, but useful all the same. In the window you're watching us on, just down below us, if you scroll down, you'll see a blue tab. It says Ask a Question. If you click on that, that's where you can type anything you want, a question or a comment. And you may want to do that as you listen to our first speaker this morning. Later we'll be going back to Tenerife, as Joe said, to Leeds, also to Pittsburgh. But we start today by saying good evening to Melbourne and to Eugen who rejoins us. Eugen, Psychiatrist and Psychoanalytic Psychotherapist, which is a title that we can all aspire to someday. That is a great title. Eugen, good evening to you. Yesterday we heard about your work with the Aboriginal communities in the Central Desert and really your base theories on culture, and I think it struck a chord when you spoke about it being like a soil and a plant, and even if you transplant the plant itself into new soil, a certain amount of their old soil, their old culture comes with them. But today we're going to move it on a little bit and see how we can put some of the learnings into practice. So from the banks of the Lagan in Belfast to you in Melbourne, it's all yours.
Good morning. Thank you, Declan. Thank you very much. I'm trying to get up my talk so I can get on to it. Thank you very much. So good morning. Thank you for inviting me to speak at your conference. Some years ago, I began working with the Aboriginals in the Central Desert of Australia, as I spoke to you about yesterday. They taught me that culture is like the cradle that holds us. They know how important culture is because they have been dispossessed of their culture by colonization. The Aboriginals told me that the aspect of their culture that makes them strong is their family, or more specifically, their kinship system. It is a system that carefully set out their relationships, which include their responsibilities to each other, and also to the natural world of flora and fauna, and to the land. They also told me that sometimes their kinship system is also a problem. For example, if a member of their kin committed a crime, they have without question an obligation to protect and fight for this person, regardless of the situation. Yes, I've come to learn from these Aboriginals that culture is the cradle that holds us. But the word hold can mean either support and care, or it can have a hold on us. Yeah? Hold can either mean support and care, or it can have a hold on us. It causes us to be stuck. It can support and nourish us like the soil to a plant, but it can also cause us to become stuck in a particular way that might not be helpful to a new situation. So such a holding might no longer be supportive, but binding. It causes us to become stuck in our ways. Well, it is okay to be stuck in a good way, but I'm sure you'll agree that if we are stuck in a bad way, we've got a problem. Culture is so important, but it can also become a problem. During my first visit to Belfast in 2008 for a conference, that was my first time I came to Belfast, I met John Lord Alderdice, who, like myself, is a psychiatrist and psychoanalytic psychotherapist, who some might remember was the first speaker of Stormont after the end of conflict. I invited him to Australia to speak at a conference that I had organized, and he learned about my work with the traumatized Aboriginal communities and invited me to come to Northern Ireland to work with him on peace building, in particular to talk about culture. So I've been coming to Northern Ireland regularly since 2015, and each time I've taken every opportunity to talk about art, culture, conflict, peace building, and trauma. As you can imagine, one person that I talked to suggested I should talk to this other person. And so I got to talk to people at Tides and Bryson. And here I am talking to you. So I would like to share with you what I've learned and thought about from facilitating a series of focus group discussions on culture and peace building organized by Bryson. For the past 5 months, almost on a weekly basis, at this very same time, actually, on the Thursday evening, 8 p.m. in Melbourne, Australia, and 9 a.m. in Belfast. Now, I've connected with 3 groups of people here in Northern Ireland through Zoom for about 1 to 1.5 hours each time, talking about culture. Before I go on, I want to acknowledge the contribution of those 28 participants. They've taken part in good faith, and they brought with them a great deal of experience and wisdom, and good humor too. They brought a generosity of spirit and goodwill and courage, and it has been an honor and a privilege to work with them. I have come to understand that in Northern Ireland, it takes courage to talk about your own culture. One of the recurring themes throughout this series of meetings was how culture has been weaponized and politicized in Northern Ireland. I was so naive when I first came here and gave a talk about cultural change. A man in the audience protested, "I'm happy with my culture, it doesn't need to change." Another said he disagreed with any suggestion of a homogenized culture. I was a little puzzled as I had not suggested anything like that. But it turned out that there is a terrible fear that if we have a homogenized culture, it will be dominated by the majority culture and the minority culture will be soon wiped out. So many people have told me that it is almost impossible to have a conversation about culture in Northern Ireland without it becoming so politicized that it becomes stuck. We talk about power, identity, and rights. So this series of meetings were in fact some sort of experiment to see if we can talk about culture without becoming stuck. Well, I'd like to begin by telling you something about the 3 groups. The first group consisted of 10 participants who were all staff of either Tides or Bryson, and most of them have been involved in facilitating discussion groups in the community. They were, if you like, my trial or practice group. There were 6 women and 2 men in this group. The second group consisted of 12, 8 men and 4 women. All of them were community leaders, including a few who were ex-combatants or ex-prisoners. The third group consisted of 6 civic leaders, 5 women and 1 man, including representatives from faith organizations. All 3 groups consisted of participants from the 3 broad groups in Northern Ireland: Protestant, Catholic, and either non-aligned or other faith or no faith. In proportions, they are somewhat reflected the distribution in the general population, with perhaps a slightly greater percentage of Protestants. So there were approximately 50% Protestant, 35% Catholic, and 15 to 20% non-aligned or either. Now, I began with each group a brief outline of my understanding of culture and framework that I've developed from my experience of working with the Aboriginals in the Central Desert. As Declan said, I recorded a version of it and was shown to you yesterday. So I hope some of you had the opportunity to see it. If you missed it, or perhaps you can try to access it. As I have only limited time, I will not repeat what was in that recording. The participants in the three groups ended their first sessions by being given a homework. I asked them to consider a scenario. I'd like you to imagine that we are starting a new Northern Island on planet B, and each of you are being asked to bring some of your culture with you. There's only enough room for 3 pieces of luggage. It is recommended that in the first luggage, you pack a culture that will help you to feel comforted and secure if you fall ill, stressed, and traumatized. In the second, please pack a culture that will help you to relate to people from a different background to yours. In the third luggage, please pack some of your cultural substrates or ingredients and instruments that we can use to build a new culture together. I was very impressed how seriously all the participants took their homework. Many commented on how they pondered on their culture all week, as to which culture to bring and which to leave behind. So I invite you to reflect for yourself, if you could, relate to any of the things that the group shared with me. Now, please take note that I'm asking people to bring aspects of their culture. This exercise is not about building a totally new culture, but about examining your culture and strengthening it. It is not about pulling the house down, but about doing some renovation and perhaps building some extensions, making the house better and bigger. So let's begin. In the first group, on the culture that will help them to feel comforted and secure when unwell, stressed, or traumatized, many suggested that having a cup of tea with family and friends can be very assuring. There was a general agreement that sharing of food is always nice and connecting. One of the participants said she will bring her faith. Another said more specifically, prayers. A few people said their faiths and rituals are very anchoring for them, which is especially important at turbulent times. One participant wanted to bring her tendency to question things and not simply accept things as they might appear in order to feel safe. Another wanted to bring aspects of a culture that encourages her creativity and imagination, helping her to think outside the box. On the second luggage, that pack aspects of the culture that help them to relate to others different from them. Many spoke about the importance of an open mind and respecting difference, mindful about exerting dominance, exchanging stories, and of course, sharing food and hospitality again. Someone spoke about bringing an attitude, an attitude that regularly asks, what can I do for you? Now, in their third luggage, packing experiences, values, and assumptions, ingredients that could be used to build new culture. They included honesty, authenticity, true to oneself, be genuine, be patient. A couple of them added negotiation skills and sensitivity. Another said real equality, really listening to each other. Another, a belief that we all have to get along. One participant said, "It would be nice if we could just start with the assumption that everyone is good, not the other way around." After addressing the scenarios as to what to take with them, the group was interested in talking about what they wanted to leave behind. One said that she wanted to leave behind that culture that doesn't want to change. Another said class structure. Another, blind obedience. Another, culture that excludes, like the misuse of flags and emblems. Many spoke about how they didn't want to bring the tendency to pigeonhole people in their boxes by making assumptions about their background or assuming which side they are on. Now, I was very impressed by all the thoughtful responses from the participants in this first group. Theirs were almost textbook responses to change culture for peace building. But I shouldn't have been surprised, as they were all seasoned workers who had been working in this field for many years. They were, however, surprised that the discussions on culture were stimulating and hopeful and didn't become politicized as they had previously experienced. The next group, consisting of community leaders, I thought would be more challenging, as I expected that they would be more political, but they were not. Now, I understand you've seen a recording of their responses to their discussion with me. Now, I would like to tell you what happened in some detail to give you a sense of what the discussion was like. The first session was much the same as it was in the third group, except the time was needed there was extra time needed for introductions and settling in, as most people didn't know each other. That session ended just as it did with the first group, being given the scenario of starting again a new Northern Ireland, again on Planet B. The second session began with the participants engaging with the exercise and sharing a wide range of responses. When contributing to the discussion of culture that helped them feel comforted and secure, ideas included the blueprint of the British welfare state that they want to bring with them. It's a bit hard to put in the luggage, but they will add them. Artifacts that celebrate their culture. Literature and education. Membership of a like-minded people, a brotherhood, a fraternity. The culture of Christmas and its emphasis on family. And values such as fairness, honesty, and respect. Now, a final contribution added the ability to laugh at ourselves. They want to bring that with them. Very important, they said. Humor. It contributes to resilience. Someone recalled a program on the Nazi death camps and how humor helped some of the Jews to survive. There is a saying, I think, that in some situations, things are so bad that we don't know if we should laugh or cry. There was much humor as we talk about Irish jokes and how an Irishman would often be accepting of such humor. I was told, despite all the seriousness of the troubles, the Irish are quite light-hearted underneath. Well, I'm sure you would agree with me. That's the case too that I found. Also, an important aspect of the Irish culture is the humor at the wake, they say. Someone said. You know it is a good wake when there is a lot of laughter. We recall the funny things in that person's life. I added that each culture has a unique sense of humor, and one can usually discover one's own tribe, so to speak, by seeing who is laughing with you. Also, one feels safer among those who laugh with them. Someone reminded us of an important aspect of the Irish culture is to make someone feel welcome And there is a traditional Irish saying, which I cannot pronounce, but I'll give it a go. It's called "Say me fail," I think, which means 100,000 welcomes. So I was subsequently told that the humor at the wake is a way to help a stranger to the community feel welcome. I mentioned to the group that I was surprised no one brought up sharing a cup of tea, which was a common response of another group. There was general agreement that this would be a useful addition. Now, this led to the discussion on food and cuisine. And someone said, well, north of the border or south of the border, the Irish breakfast is the same. Now, there were some misgivings about fries, but there was general agreement that the cooked breakfast was very much the same all over Ireland, north or south of the border. There was also agreement that the sharing of a meal was something that would make people feel safe. The discussion on commonality didn't last long, as attention turned to differences in music, especially musical instruments. The Northern Irish Protestant drum, the lembe, is distinctly different from the bodhrán, the Celtic Irish drum, I was told. My mind drifted briefly to the song by Linda Ronstadt and the Stone Pony, The Different Drum, which begins with, "You and I travel to the beat of a different drum." Now, I've checked the designs of the two drums on the internet. The lembe certainly looks different from the bodhrán. Their resonances, the sound, are different too. But I wonder, however different these two drums were, could their beats, could their rhythm be at least in sync, at least on some occasions? The third session went straight into the heart of the matter. Culture in the context of Northern Ireland is more complex than what you hear in the media and what you read, I was told. There is the issue of class. During the conflict, the working class fought more for their culture than the upper or middle class. I wondered out loud about the complex relationship between culture and religion. One said it's difficult to generalize, as for some people, their culture is more intertwined with religion, while others, it is more related to social class. There is a fear of each other's culture in Northern Ireland, several people said. And when I inquired as to where have this fear come from, several people pointed out that the problems of segregated education and segregation in general. More than 90% of Northern Ireland still live in segregated areas, I was told. One of the most significant passages of discussion throughout this series of meetings was on language. A major issue is the question of the Irish language and who owns the language, someone said. Several participants from the Protestant background shared their personal experiences of being excluded from using the Irish language. One was specifically told by nationalists at a public meeting that he did not have the right to use the language. Most participants from the Protestant community expressed an interest, though, in the Irish language. There was a strong agreement among them all that the Irish language has often been weaponized to exclude and diminish those from the Protestant culture. One expressed concern that the Irish language is being used to obliterate his culture. The example cited was the naming of places and institutions, like the proposal to rename the Queen's University. Participants from the Catholic background emphasized no one should be excluded from using the Irish language, nor should it be used to exclude anyone. It belongs to all the people. The weaponization of language is part of a broader politicization of culture, I think, which is a recurring theme throughout the discussion during this third session. One participant put it succinctly. In Northern Ireland, culture is used as a weapon by both sides of the communities, leaving us with fear of the other. It seems to me both sides appear to be operating under a zero-sum psychology. I explained to the group that a zero-sum psychology is a mentality where there can only be one winner and the other is a loser. Or, if the other is a winner, I'm the loser. If one culture is deemed important, the other must, by implication, be less important or unimportant. There is no possibility of both being equally important. There is no possibility of both sides being winners or both sides being losers. So if the Irish language is used to name a place, the implication is either the English language is not important or vice versa. It seems that one language must replace another rather than coexist with equal respect and importance. Such is the zero-sum mentality. The possibility of coexistence, win-win situation, is not entertained. A zero-sum mentality is also a two-party mentality. It is unable to accommodate the third or others. Now, two of the participants were relatively new migrants to Northern Ireland. Their participation brought into awareness of the others in Northern Ireland that are not aligned to either the Protestant or the Catholic faith. It highlights the existence of a domain of culture in Northern Ireland that is outside the two historic groupings. I understand that this third group has grown significantly in the past 20 years since the end of conflict and could be contributing to the creation of a new so-called Northern Irish culture, a mix of all three groupings. The fourth session was open up for any follow-up on what had been discussed so far. One participant raised the issue of segregated education and the problems it created. It led to a discussion on the selective teaching of history in respective schools. All agreed on the importance of history. History, as one said, whether you like it or not, shapes us into who we are. The question of contested history was raised. But there is only one slice of history, he said, but there can be two or more interpretations. Facts stand for itself. The discussion returned to the teaching of history in Northern Ireland. No one taught us the history of Northern Ireland, only about the mainland, about the kings and queens. We were not taught about the First World War. Another Protestant added, we were only taught about 1066, but not about Willie McBride. A Catholic participant asked, quite sensitively, why the headstones of Unionist veteran graves from the First World War were not attended to, and whether this was widespread. Several Protestants in the group said that it was widespread and spoke of how that part of Northern Ireland history has sadly been neglected. When I asked why, their responses included, it was a dirty history. Too many truths have been hidden in our history. There is a whole history that affects us, though. Whether it is from a unionist or a nationalist point of view, it affected us and it should be taught. The significance of the First World War in Northern Irish history did not occur to me until some weeks after that meeting. Specifically, it was the last time men from both north and south of the border fought together and not against each other, as many would in the Civil War and for the next 100 years. I wonder if there was a version of Northern Ireland history that began 100 years ago in 1921, with all that occurred prior to that year being subsumed under British history. And then there is another version of history in the Catholic communities that is traced back to ancient Celtic history. If I have understood correctly, the dominant British version of the First World War did not give due acknowledgement to the Irish sacrifice, and Ireland had to assert their contribution through a great deal of documentation after the independence. I wonder if the Northern Irish Protestant contribution has been and continues to be neglected, as suggested by the neglect of their veteran graves. I feel there is an unspoken sadness about this, a terrible sadness, that the lack of recognition for their terrible loss among the Protestants in the group. A discussion on culture would be quite incomplete without explicitly addressing the issue of cultural identity, especially in Northern Ireland. The participants in the meeting were reluctant to engage in what they viewed as politicization of cultural identity that reduces them to who they are, to only green and orange. The discussions that emerged over these 4 meetings demonstrated that their sense of identity is much more complex, especially for the participants from the Protestant communities. I have been wrong to form the impression that people from Protestant communities, Unionists and Loyalists, see themselves as only British. Such a reductionistic view is an oversimplification that may have been influenced by the political conversations that I have had. These meetings here, particularly in the discussion about language, told me that there are Protestants who want to reclaim their Irish heritage. There is quite possible that there are Protestants who could trace a pure lineage to the plantation era and will continue to see themselves as only British. Even they, I think, would have absorbed some aspects of the Irish culture in the way most migrants do. I'm beginning to think that the Protestant in Northern Ireland as having dual cultural citizenship or heritage. But again, I could be wrong. I'm still learning, so tell me. But if this is so, to deny them of the Irish cultural heritage will be to rob them of a part of themselves. From my limited understanding, I see that they have been denied by both their Irish cousins who weaponize their culture to exclude them, as well as their British cousins who demand an allegiance for political expediency without consideration of their own cultural complexity and richness. I think this short series of discussion was quite successful in having both Protestant and Catholic community leaders explore their respective cultures together in considerable depth. It was made possible by the creation of a safe and supportive space, the courageous and generous spirits of the participants, and their ability to resist the politicization of culture, which too often lead to fear and paralysis. The third group of civic leaders was a small group of only 6. A few representatives of political parties were invited, but they expressed interest, but did not attend. The participants of this group also responded to the scenarios given with interest, and much of what they said had already been said, so I will not repeat them. This group, however, articulated something quite important that has not been said explicitly in the previous 2 groups. Right from the outset, the issue of who was included or excluded was on the table. A youth leader welcomed the opportunity to be included in these meetings, but highlighted how the youth are generally excluded from the political process or discussion about the future of Northern Ireland. Many have felt so disillusioned that they have disengaged from the political process, or indeed any process. They are lost. There seemed to be a disconnect between those who went through the troubles and those who were born afterwards. I thought to myself, the high rates of suicides among the youth and the impact of transgenerational trauma in Northern Ireland. The youth leader reiterated comments from the older generation, like, I went through the conflict, what do you know about trauma? Now, I have heard similar comments told in Northern Ireland, just as I have heard from many children and grandchildren of survivors of Jewish Holocaust and the Cambodian killing fields back in Melbourne. The generation that suffered directly often have no idea or dismiss the suffering of the generation that followed them. This is what happened in transgenerational trauma. The leader from a Muslim faith expressed frustration that those who do not identify themselves as either Catholic or Protestant are not included in any ongoing Northern Irish narrative. These comments highlighted who are excluded. They also raised the important question, where can those who are not aligned fit in to what has been exclusively a binary narrative? He cited the example of how a Hindu man was killed, and the media was only concerned if he was by a Protestant or a Catholic, with no concern for what happened to the man or his family. The presence of the non-aligned participants highlight again how they struggle to find a place in the Northern Irish narrative. There seems to be an automatic assumption that since the dominant narrative is one of conflict, it will always be. Is there or can there be a narrative that goes beyond conflict? The generosity and goodwill of this small third group was so strong that I decided to set them a challenge for their third and last session. I asked them to bring something about their culture that was either too difficult to talk about, or indeed unspeakable, or perhaps almost unspeakable, as I wanted them to speak about them. They did not shy away from that challenge. Now, given the condition of confidentiality, with the understanding that what has been shared will not be repeated outside the focus group, I will only discuss what was shared in general terms without personal attribution as to who said what. The first unspeakable was the things that happened during the conflict, which included killings and other unlawful acts. My mind turned to the exhibition Silent Testimony of Colin Davidson, which I saw at the Ulster Museum in 2015. I recall his moving images, large portraits of people who lost someone through sectarian killings. But it was the painting of Jean McConville, Clutching a Pillow by Paddy McCann at the Metropolitan Art Centre that still unsettles me to this day. I've often pondered on the possible impact of the disappearance of people during the conflict on the whole population of Northern Ireland over those 3 decades. Even though only 16 people were recorded as disappeared, the thought that anyone can just disappear would drive a deep fear in the communities. The second unspeakable was the violence against women, not only during the conflict, but it is still happening, and it remains too difficult to talk about. This was raised by a few women in the group, and the rest of the group was quick to nod in quiet agreement, perhaps reflecting the continuing difficulty in speaking about it. The third unspeakable was suicide. The group struggled to talk about it. They didn't know what to say except to acknowledge that it is a problem. I understand that the suicide rate in the 2 decades since the end of conflict has consistently been 3 times higher than during and before the conflict. And I've been told more than once by many workers that I've spoken to in recent years here in Northern Ireland that more people have died by suicide since the conflict than older people during the conflict. This third group demonstrated how such a high level of mutual trust and goodwill can enable them to bring up the unspeakables of their culture. It confirmed my belief that if a safe and supportive environment can be created, such frank discussion of considerable depth can take place. Now, I'd like to finish now by concluding that this series of meetings has demonstrated that if it is carefully constructed, starting with the appreciation of the strength of your culture, especially those that makes you feel safe, the conversation will find itself moving into territories that most have otherwise found it extremely difficult. The organizers of this conference asked me to say something about how I imagine as to where to from here. How might you build what has been achieved so far? Many people in Northern Ireland I've spoken to have told me that the peace is fragile and peace building in many areas have become stuck, held back, it seems, by cultural factors. In order to address cultural issues or to change culture, we need to talk about culture. And because culture is a phenomenon that consists of shared experiences and shared consciousness, we need to talk about it together. We need to examine it together and imagine it together. What new and more helpful culture might look like. So begin by talking together among your own kind to examine your own culture. Then compare notes together across the divides and learn something new. Then return to your own tribe again and consider your culture again with these new insights. And back to talking across the divides and so forth. We will need to do this in small groups, like the meeting described here in this presentation. We are more likely to create a safe space, a space that is sufficiently safe and supportive. It's important to address difficult and painful subjects. I have conducted about 20 of these meetings here in Northern Ireland, or maybe a little bit more. I would like to facilitate 100 of these small group discussions over the next few years, if it is possible and supported. Once a critical number of people have been reached, such conversation could possess a life of its own and proceed more informally without them being staged. I would like to imagine that this talk about culture could take a national conversation, could reach a national conversation, where culture is not taken for granted and it is not confused with tradition, and where it can be critically examined with the aim of highlighting and fostering culture that promotes and sustains peace building. Such a societal-wide conversation will necessarily involve the media, the civil society, and across all sectors, societies, communities, and government. Now, this is not a wild idea. In Australia, we have for 1 week each year a national conversation. It is led by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, the ABC, the equivalent of the BBC. And the ABC would focus all their programming during that week on that topic. And so far it has been on mental health. And then community organizations from civil societies and increasingly from governments join in with their own programs during that week. And everyone will think about, talk about, and consider mental health issues broadly. So a societal-wide conversation can be achievable. The aim of this conversation is not about talking about culture for culture's sake. It is about creating a Northern Irish narrative, not a totally new narrative or culture, but a narrative that goes beyond conflict, a narrative that goes beyond the Protestant-Catholic divide, a narrative that is inclusive of the third, across faith, across generations, and across politics. It will be a narrative that will embrace lost parts of history and one that embraces differences as much as commonality. I would like to imagine a compassionate and peace-building narrative. I have learned a lot from these discussions about culture. And one of the things I've learned is that if you start with politics, you'll likely not get anywhere. But if you start with culture, you will never know where it could take you. As for my part, I am an outsider to Northern Ireland. I come to you with an attitude not as an expert, but as someone who is ignorant about your culture, but someone who is interested in your culture. The Aboriginals explain to each other, really. So whenever I visit them, they will tell each other, he's here to help us talk about what is too painful, too sad, too shameful, and too angry to talk about. I hope to find, when I come to you, I hope to find in my luggage an aspect of your Irish culture, the aspect that says, I will not leave you stuck. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Eugen, thank you very much. In the absence of a room full of people listening to you closely, this is the point where we would applaud. It's a little bit strange in the pandemic era, but I'm sure people have been given lots to think about by what you've said. There's a couple of things I'd love to pick out, and I'd invite everyone watching from wherever they are watching to please don't lose this opportunity to put something to Eugen or to ask a question. It's the blue tab underneath the window in which you're watching us. It'll say ask a question, put it in there, and it will appear here. I want to start with one of those questions, Eugen, if that's all right. You have spoken about people taking parts of their culture to a different place, and you say there are three elements of that if they were to take with them, they should think about what those three elements are. Can I put that to you? If you were to transplant yourself into a different culture, what are the three parts of your culture that you would take with you?
Yeah. Well, I can tell you, it's a funny thing. Thanks for your question, Declan. I didn't expect that question. But as a migrant, I had to take some parts of my culture with me. The funny thing is that when we go to a new place, we just go, right? We don't think about bringing our culture, and then later we do. But of course, the first thing that we often think about are the food that we missed, the food that comfort us, the things that comfort us. Because when we go to a new place, it's very challenging. And I find comfort in food, particularly familiar food that we grew up with. So that's one thing. And the second thing that I would like to bring from my culture is one of a welcome, a concern for the other. Now, this again relates to food. I have shared with some of the group members that in the town that I come from, we have a very peculiar greeting. In the West, you always greet each other as good morning, good day. In the town I come from, when we meet each other, we ask each other, have you eaten yet? And because if you have not eaten, it is my responsibility to make sure you have. So a care for another, a concern for another, a care for another is my second part. And the third is an openness. a value, and that we hopefully don't make too many assumptions. And it is with that openness that I bring to all my work when I go to another culture. So my attitude, this is what I like to bring the third. My attitude is, I am ignorant. I'm ignorant about your culture. If I'm going to come and live in your country, I need to take on some of your culture. I need to understand your culture. So I'm ignorant, so teach me. And I'm interested, teach me, tell me, share with me. So that we can then co-create perhaps some new culture.
Let me talk a little bit about your technique when you are facilitating these dialogues in Northern Ireland or elsewhere. Because we are expecting those who've taken part in the dialogue about race and ethnicity here to hopefully go on and become community hosts and champions. On a very practical level, what is your technique when you walk into a room full of people you haven't met? You proclaim yourself to be ignorant but interested, but I'm sure there's a lot going on in your mind. You're very conscious of how you are appearing, what you are asking. Can you step us through a little bit of that technique?
Okay. Well, firstly, I have to abandon anything that I'm conscious about myself. If I'm too conscious about myself, if I'm too concerned about how I come across, then I've got a problem that I'm not able to focus on those in the room. But I would make sure that I understand or know who's in the room and be mindful of every single person in the room and keep them in mind. So I would watch them, I would particularly look for signs of discomfort or agitation, and to make sure that they're not left out, they're not forgotten. So, but then I try to make them feel safe by addressing particularly the things that are not safe. Often when things that are not safe, we try to push them aside. But my approach is to confront the things that are not safe. We have to face them head on and deal with that, because only then we will make things safe. Because otherwise, if we pretend that everything is can be forgotten or ignored, then if we collude with avoiding the difficult subject or things that don't make us feel safe, then I'm of no use to them. So I see myself as to be, in order to be of some use to them, I need to not collude with any secrecy or avoidance. I need to engage with them as an outsider, and continue to challenge them. I'm not sure if I that's enough, or I can keep going.
No, it's interesting. It's interesting, and I think it takes it from the theoretical into the practical, because we can read these reports and do these courses, but ultimately, if we are expected to or want to influence change in our communities, then any kind of practical advice, I think is useful. Questions have started to come in. Thank you for them, and please don't hesitate to click on the blue tab below the screen, and I'll put them to Eugen straight away. Let me go to one that's come in. They may not be in any specific order, forgive me for that, but we'll just jump in as and when they arrive. This one, Eugen says, when co-creating, how do we ensure all the pressure isn't put on the minority groups, but that they are included and supported to enable inclusion and a sense of belonging?
The way I see it is, the key word is responsibility. If we are co-creating, It is the responsibility of the majority groups to include the minority group. But it is also the responsibility of the minority group to participate, to take up the challenge. Now, you might say that the minority group often feel disempowered. And it is the responsibility of the majority group to empower them. So it is a process, in the true process of co-creating, all partners are responsible for each other. Because if we are really participating in the project of co-creating, we either succeed together or we sink together. So we are responsible to keep each other afloat and be and participate and co-create together. So it is, if you like, a shared and collective responsibility.
Let's go to this question from Patrick. He says, in our modern multicultural environment, would it be better, and he's talking specifically, I think, about Northern Ireland here, he said, would it be better to stop focusing on trying to understand the Protestant, Catholic, green-orange cultures, but focus on embracing all cultures for a more valuable shared experience by all? Really, he's asking, are we too narrow in maybe what we define or consider as inclusiveness?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that it is narrow and interesting. As I said in the second group, the community leaders resisted the reductionistic tendency to reduce simply to orange and green. There are many different shades, and so I think it is. But as I speak, I'm also sensitive to the danger, though, of ignoring the orange and green. That even though they may be reductionistic, there's a lot of history there. There's a lot of wealth of wisdom and strength and richness and heritage. So my concern is sometimes when we talk about multiculturalism, the tendency is to have the assumption that the dominant culture must be put down, or the historically dominant culture must be put down. Now that creates a problem, and this is the tension that we see everywhere. Whether we're talking about United States or anywhere, between if you want to create a new culture, how to integrate, the key word is integration, how to integrate between the new culture, the migrant culture, and how to continue to assure the old historic dominant culture that still has a place. Yeah, we're not wiping the slate totally clean and building again, but the historic dominant culture has a place. The challenge is how to work together to find that place.
There is an argument that some of the work that has been done between the orange and green communities in Northern Ireland over the last couple of decades should possibly have achieved more by this stage, and now is an opportunity to start having conversations with the new communities who have been coming to Northern Ireland. People may or may not agree with that, but is it practical to start moving on to have dialogues with these newer communities if in fact the problems with the green and orange issue hasn't been put to bed, or do they just need to coexist as two dialogues?
I think they are parallel dialogues.
Yeah.
But the interesting thing that some of the dialogues that we had in these meetings that we just had, that I've spoken about, that the presence of the minority communities or the new communities actually helped the historic communities to look at their culture in a different way. I think the dynamics of the group, the presence of the third actually enable or resisted the tendency for us to just go to the two communities. You follow?
Yeah,
So
it shakes things up a little.
Yeah. So therefore there are parallel dialogues going on all the time. I don't think it's one or the other.
It's a great question from Joe, who's watching. How do we ensure the support and care for those in a group brave enough to speak the unspeakable?
How do we support them?
Yeah. I mean, it's one thing, I assume what Joe was saying is it's one thing to kind of invite people to say the unspeakable or things that they wouldn't say in another context. But what do you do once they've said it? What responsibility is on you as the facilitator?
Oh, my responsibility as a facilitator is very great, is to ensure that the group is able to hold it. The group is able to support it. I would not have brought it up if I didn't think the group is able to support each other. So it was a remarkable group. They got there very quickly. Some groups will take many meetings before they can get to a point where they are willing to support each other in talking about the unspeakable. But I was also very impressed with all the three groups, how quickly they move to really appreciate each other, support each other. The generosity that was there is quite remarkable. So the answer to the question is that the group itself is important, but I also think that the individuals, if the individuals were to be encouraged to talk, they need to be supported outside the group as well, not just in the group, but outside the group. So if I know that I'm going to pursue, so when the matters were brought up, I didn't push it further or more detail. If I were going to do that, I would need to set up or make sure that the people would be supported ongoingly outside the group.
Please don't be listening to this with a question in your mind that you think, I'd kind of like to ask that, but I dare not. These are really helpful, the questions that we're getting. So if you're watching this, click the Ask the Question button and put your comment or question in there, and we'll put it to Eugen in the next couple of minutes. Can I pick out a theme that you touched on? This idea that communities that have experienced trauma regress somewhat. And part of that regression is that they, and I'm going back to one of your articles that you wrote, you said that in these collectives of people, they return to a pattern of group functioning. For example, an increased blind dependency on their leaders. Now, the P word, politicians, has come up already today. It came up yesterday. We have Stormont or local assembly elections next year. Talk to me about our blind dependency on politicians and how, or whether we should challenge that. And if we do need to challenge that in ourselves and in our communities, how do we do it?
Well, I think firstly, can I say a little bit more about this blind dependency?
You sure can.
We have a very good example with Donald Trump, that the 72 million people who voted for him is able to put aside everything else. Yeah? I'm amazed that they're able to put aside everything else and to have a blind dependency on him. Everything that he said or done doesn't matter. It is, in that sense, it's dangerous because he's almost therefore untouchable by this group of people. So the blind dependency is necessary because in these regress groups, they cannot think for themselves. as I've indicated in one of the things that happens, is there is an impairment of thinking. And if you can't think for yourself, you're like an infant. You are blindly dependent on your caregiver. And you don't question it. If you're a child, you don't even think about questioning because you desperately need them and you have no other alternative because you can't think for yourselves. That is a problem. So until people can think for themselves, until we reclaim and regain our ability to think, and the civil society has to do that. Representatives, leaders, other leaders have to reclaim the right to think for themselves and think for their communities. Otherwise, this blind dependency will always be there. Challenging the leaders itself can only go so far, but unless the communities themselves can think for themselves and come up with alternatives, this blind dependency will need to continue.
These conversations, you said, work best in small groups. So is there any place for larger groups, larger discussions? There have been talks, in fact, there were attempts in Northern Ireland at one stage, didn't last very long, for a kind of civic forum. It was mentioned yesterday as well. Large kind of feedback sessions, big community-wide discussions. Do they have a role, or truly does this work best, and particularly in maybe the first instance, of small groups? And how small is a small group?
I'm inclined to start with a small group because of the delicateness and the need to keep things safe. And but once you reach a critical mass of people who can keep things safe and who can continue to maintain a safe, supportive environment, then you can increase the conversations to larger groups. And in terms of the size of a small group, it shouldn't be too small. I think I've indicated to Bryson initially that something between 10 to 15 people to a maximum of 20 could be accommodated. Particularly if you're doing it through Zoom, that has another limitation too. But after a critical number of small groups, you can move to larger groups when you have people who understand the importance of support and sensitivities.
Let me bring you a couple more questions. This one from Des. He said, my question is, should we also question assumptions in our own respective cultures and challenge those who hold fixed positions?
Absolutely. In fact, this series of meetings that I presented is all about our own community. This is where we need to begin. We begin by examining our own communities. And that is one of the things that makes it safe. That we shouldn't be trying to start by talking about other people's community, commenting about other people's community. The view that I take is that you are the expert of your own community. So this is where one should start with people of your own tribe, so to speak, and examine your own community, your own culture, before a discussion over the divide. I have to admit that when Bryson suggested to me that we should have cross-divide discussion over divide, I was a bit nervous. I think the discussion should begin with your own community, feel that it can be done safely, securely, and strengthen your own community, then have cross-community or cross-divides discussion.
Michael asks, how likely is it for migrant cultures within Northern Ireland to be able to have a lasting impact and influence on the change of culture here?
I think so. I think so. What can I say? Let's take one element of culture. Okay, an element of culture that is quite non-political, mostly. Probably the most non-political aspect of culture is food. So if you look at the food that you have in Northern Ireland today, that particularly food, the cuisine that are brought in by the migrant culture, compare that to 20 years ago. If you see the change from 20 years ago to where you are today, the type of range of food that you have, and think in 20 years' time, how much more varied and interesting the food can be. Then you can imagine what the culture might be like if you really integrate them. If you enable a rich exchange and building together.
Yesterday we spoke about self-care. How do you manage your self-care, this idea of secondary trauma, burdening yourself with some of the concerns and stories that you're hearing? What's your process?
I think the most important thing is to realize that I'm not alone. Yeah? If you know you're not alone and you can talk to others, there will always be someone to talk to, someone to share your burden with. Then it becomes manageable. If you feel that you are alone, then it becomes problematic. One of the problems is people who feel that they can save the world, they have a sense that they can do it alone, then we are at risk of burning out at best. So to have a community behind you, a community that shares and supports you is very important. So, and that is the other reason why I suggest that we start with small groups, because small groups can sustain and support each other.
Eugen, we're very grateful for your time today. Leave us with one thought, though. In this sphere, in your experience, what is the one thing that you know for sure about all this?
My goodness. Well, the one thing I know for sure is to answer your question, Macklin, is I have to think about it.
Fair enough. Good cop. Thank you very much. That's Dr. Eugen Coe speaking to us from Melbourne. It's the end of the day where he is, but of course we are just starting off our Thursday here in Belfast. From all of us watching, thank you very much, Dr. Eugen Coe. A really, really interesting chat, and I know you've been saying that on our message board as well. Fascinating discussion, fabulous talk from Dr. Coe.